scooping the girl into his arms despite her startled gasp and retreating into the hallway, while Ramirez and Cole repositioned to cover the front entrance, rain blowing in through the shattered door as headlights cut through the darkness, and a figure stepped out of the car, silhouetted against lightning, hands raised before anyone could shout a command, a woman's voice carrying steady through the storm. "Stand down, Echo." And Ramirez froze, because even distorted by wind and years, he knew. That voice. Protocol screamed at him to maintain posture, to treat her as unknown until cleared. But something older and deeper rooted him in place. And as she stepped into the foyer light, drenched but defiant, there was no mistaking her. Mara, alive, eyes sharper than memory, a faint scar tracing her jawline that hadn't been there before. And she looked not at the men aiming rifles at her, but at the little girl in Hayes' arms. "Lily, honey, it's okay." And the child reached toward her, whispering again. Echo came back, as if reciting a promise. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire, because in that moment the operation's narrative unraveled. Mara wasn't a hostage. She wasn't a suspect in the database Hayes had reviewed, and yet the man in the basement had been flagged for ties to foreign intelligence. And here she was connected to both him and Ramirez by threads none of them understood. Hayes ordered weapons lowered but not holstered, voice-controlled. "Mara, you need to explain why your name isn't anywhere in the file and why this man thinks he can summon you." And she gave a tight smile that held no humor. "Because the file you were given isn't the whole story, Lieutenant," which made Hayes' stomach sink, because the only thing worse than bad intel was incomplete intel by design. What followed unfolded in fractured pieces as MPs arrived and the target was escorted out under heavy guard, his eyes flicking toward Mara with something like betrayal. And in the relative quiet of the living room, with rain still tapping against broken wood, she told them the truth she could share. That years ago, after the extraction gone wrong, she'd been pulled into a black program, deep cover, no contact, building a persona that would get her close to networks the government couldn't reach with drones or raids. And somewhere along the way, she'd discovered that the man they'd just captured was planning to defect, to sell names of undercover assets, including hers, and she had orchestrated tonight's events to flush him out before he could disappear. But she hadn't expected the SEAL team assigned to snatch him to include Ramirez. The room felt smaller with every word, because this wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about trust, about the way the machine sometimes used its sharpest tools without telling them the whole blueprint. And Ramirez finally found his voice. "You let me think you were dead." And she met his gaze without flinching. "If you'd known I was alive, you would have tried to find me, and that would have gotten us both killed." And Lily, oblivious to the geopolitical weight pressing on the walls, slipped from Hayes' arms and ran to Ramirez, wrapping her tiny arms around his leg in a gesture so instinctive it bypassed every barrier he'd built over a decade of war. And he stood there stunned as she looked up and said, "Mom says you're brave but stubborn." And for the first time that night, laughter, raw and disbelieving, broke through the tension. But the twist none of them saw coming wasn't in the past. It was in the next phone call, when Hayes' secure line buzzed and a clipped voice from command informed him that the captured target had already been claimed by another agency and that Mara was not to be detained or questioned further, that her involvement was classified beyond his clearance, and that his team was to file a standard after-action report omitting her presence entirely, as if the most human part of the night had never occurred. Hayes ended the call slowly, eyes moving from Mara to Ramirez to the little girl who had unknowingly detonated a buried history with a single whispered sentence. And he realized that the freeze they'd felt upstairs hadn't been weakness, but recognition. That sometimes the battlefield isn't a desert or a city block, but the space between duty and love. In the days that followed, the official narrative was tidy. The suspect apprehended, intelligence secured, no. Civilian casualties, commendations likely. Yet none of that made it into the private story that 7 men carried with them. The image of a child invoking a call sign like a lifeline. The revelation that one of their own had a piece of his heart walking around in pigtails and rain boots. And Ramirez faced a decision no training manual covered. Remain the operator who disappeared into missions without attachments, or step into the complicated light of a life that included school recitals and bedtime stories, and a woman who operated in shadows deeper than his own. The final twist came quietly weeks later when Hayes received an unmarked envelope containing a single photograph of his team from that night, taken from across the street before they'd breached, proof that someone had been watching the watchers, and on the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Echo always comes back." A reminder that in a world of classified files and deniable operations, the most powerful forces are the promises we make and the names we answer to. And somewhere in Virginia, when thunder rolls and rain paints the streets silver, a little girl sleeps knowing that 7 seals once froze, not out of fear, but because they remembered that even warriors have call signs that lead them home. Before we begin, I need you to lean in close and imagine this is real, because somewhere in America tonight, a door will splinter under a battering ram, boots will pound down a dark hallway, and a secret will change lives forever. So if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the hidden ties that bind our warriors to the ones they love mean something to you, hit subscribe right now and stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that reminds us why heroes don't always wear uniforms, and why sometimes the smallest voice in the room can stop 7 of the most dangerous men in the world in their tracks. The rain had started just after dusk, a cold Atlantic drizzle that painted the narrow Virginia streets in silver reflections, and the 7 seals moved through it like shadows, faces streaked with camouflage, rifles tight to their chests, every breath measured, every footstep silent despite the storm. The intel was clear. A high-value target with suspected terror ties had barricaded himself inside a modest 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Hostages possible, explosives likely, and I'd send dime running thin, and Lieutenant Hayes, call sign Viking, raised a fist to halt his team just short of the porch steps as thunder rolled low over the rooftops, because something about the house felt wrong. Not tactically wrong, but human wrong, like stepping into a memory you didn't know you had. They stacked on the door, Ramirez on the ram, Cole on breach charge standby, Winters covering rear, and Hayes counted down with silent fingers. 3, 2, 1. Wood exploded inward and the team flooded the entryway in a blur of disciplined violence, clearing corners, shouting commands, lasers slicing through dust and darkness, boots pounding up the staircase as a crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. And then they heard it. Not a gunshot, not a scream exactly, but a small, trembling whisper from behind the half-open door of what looked like a child's bedroom. Please don't shoot. And even before they reached it, something in Hayes' chest tightened. Cole nudged the door, open with the barrel of his rifle, and there, huddled beside a twin bed covered in faded superhero sheets, was a little girl no older than 7, her dark curls plastered to her cheeks, clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly its seams were straining, her wide eyes reflecting 7 green laser dots that danced over the walls but never touched her. Because every one of those men had adjusted instinctively, and Hayes lowered his weapon first, kneeling slowly as he spoke in the calmest voice he could. Summon. Hey, sweetheart, we're not here to hurt you. We're here to make sure everyone's safe. But she didn't look at him when she answered. She looked past him at Ramirez's shoulder patch, at the trident insignia half visible beneath his rain-slicked jacket, and she whispered words that made the air leave the room in a single silent gasp. My mother uses that call sign. And for a second, no one moved, because Ramirez's call sign was Echo, and only 6 other men in the world knew that the first person to ever call him that wasn't a commanding officer or a teammate, but a woman he'd loved 15 years ago, a woman who had disappeared from his life without warning. Hayes felt it ripple through the stack like a shockwave, the micro-hesitation that would have gotten them chewed out in training, but here, now, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. And Ramirez slowly lowered his rifle too, his voice rougher than it had been in a firefight in Fallujah. What did you say, kiddo? And she swallowed, glancing toward the hallway as if afraid someone might hear. My mom says when she's scared she remembers Echo, because Echo always comes back. And Cole shot Ramirez a look that was equal parts confusion and dawning recognition, because there had been a woman once, a linguist embedded on a joint operation overseas, brilliant and fearless, who'd vanished after an extraction gone wrong. Presumed dead by some, reassigned by others, and Ramirez had never talked about it except once, drunk and staring at the ocean, when he'd said her name was Mara. Hayes keyed his mic softly, ordering Winters to secure the rest of the house and confirm the target's status, because suddenly the mission had split into 2 layers, the one on paper and the one unfolding in the fragile space between a frightened child and a man who hadn't expected his past to materialize in a suburban bedroom. And within minutes, Winters' voice crackled back. Target in custody, unarmed. Looks like he was trying to torch documents in the basement. No other hostiles, which should have been the end of it. A clean op with a surprising civilian complication. But the little girl shook her head when Hayes told her it was over. No, it's not over. He said she'd come if he called her. And that's when they heard it. The low growl of an engine pulling into the driveway. tires crunching over wet gravel, and every instinct in those 7 men flared back to life. They moved like a single organism, Hayes,